Welcome to another segment of provocative conversations destined to provoke further thought and spark greater questions regarding God, church, and the religious establishments of both the past and the present. I am the proud heretic, Mr. Provocateur himself. Hello. I am the proud heretic. Proud in the sense that I am humbled to be considered amongst those such as Jesus himself as being a heretic. It shows that I am not considered amongst the majority. You know, there is a verse that says, wide is the gate that leads to destruction, and many there'll be that'll go there, and narrow is the gate that leads to a better revelation of truth, a deeper, more intimate revelation of truth. Jesus said to Peter, flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but this came from. So it speaks of a revelation that goes deeper than tradition, deeper than the church, deeper than your shallow belief. There is a verse in the Bible that says, for my ways are not your ways and my thoughts are not your thoughts. As far as the east is from the west, so are my ways. So it lets me know that I'm in good company. It lets me know that there is a degree, there is a dimension in God, a dimension in words, in truths, in truths, THS, that supersede that of our human existence, that can be obtained within the human realm itself. The Bible says that, for we have the mind of Christ. This mind, this Christed mind, it goes deeper than this physical, intellectual, consciously obtained set of knowledge, set of information that we can get on this side of the earth. The Bible says the foolishness, wisdom, the wisdom of this world. It speaks of these things. It speaks along those lines. Well, there is a deeper, and perhaps that's what many so-called, so-named heretics are tapping into. That greaterness of what is seen on the surface of religion and tradition and even the Bible. So I am proud in that sense to be amongst even those such as Jesus. Well, we're still on dealing with the divine season of the pandemic. We're living through it. We're being shifted through it. We're flowing through it spiritually, physically, emotionally, whether we like it or not, whether we even believe it or not. In this particular subtopic, I want to talk about something that I said was coming, or that I was going to share, which is a vision / dream that I had in relation to what I received from God that amazed me. And it's in relation to the pandemic season. Now, I'm not one to have a dream necessarily. I can recall something that Paul stated in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. I want to speak on that verse in order to give meaning to or explanation as to why I said I had a vision / dream. I don't know which one it was. I believe it was a combination of both. However, I do know that I was semi-awake because I had already awakened for the morning. Yet, it was maybe 6 something in the morning, and I was something to that effect, or 7 o'clock. And I was laying there, and I began to I just was brought into I don't know what I would call it, but I'll say it how Paul said it in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. He said, "This boasting will do no good, but I must go on to boast anyway." I'm in the New Living Translation. He says, "I will reluctantly tell about visions and revelations from the Lord." He says, "I was caught up in the third heaven 14 years ago." He says, now whether I was in my body or out of my body, it's almost like he's saying whether I was in a vision or whether I was in a dream or what it was, I'm not sure. He says, I don't know. He says, only God knows. He says, yes, only God knows whether I was in my body or outside of my body. I can say this to you. In the vision that I had, I saw myself in my body, yet I was outside of my body as to where I was physically in my room, in my bedroom, on the bed. But I was outside of my body in the sense that I traveled somewhere that I had never been and that I had never seen. And it was all amazing to me how it took place. But anyway, he says, but I do not know. He says, but I do know that I was caught up to paradise, and I heard things so astounding that they cannot be expressed in words, things no human is allowed to tell. Paul seemingly stated that I was caught up into a vision, into a moment, into a futuristic moment that is yet present. And I heard things, I experienced, I saw things that I don't even have the words to express. Human language does not do it justice for what I heard, for what I saw. He's saying, I don't know if the words that I want to say will do justice. In fact, he almost says that I know that the words that I would say would not do it justice as to what I actually saw, what I actually heard or experienced. What I'm getting ready to tell you is not necessarily going to do it justice for what I saw, but it will do it more justice than none. I will get as close as possible to what I saw. I've seen several things within what I saw. I've seen these things already begin to come into fruition, come about in the natural. But anyway, this was on March the 31st of 2020. I had already awakened for the morning, and I was laying there on my bed, and I was just pondering. I always, when I wake up, I ponder. I wake up pondering. I go to bed pondering, and I wake up pondering. I wake up in the night pondering. I'm always pondering. And I laid there pondering. I'm laying out my day, or making sure I go over how I laid my day out in my head. So before I put feet to the floor, I'm already walking through what I'm going to do, at least in the beginning hours of the day, because I'm mapping out my day. Not that I go to bed without mapping out my day. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't, but I have an idea of what I'm going to do. And anyone who knows me, like my children and my spouse do, they know that I do not have empty days. I try to get the most out of every day, to the point that I tire myself out. Well, on this day, on March the 31st, remember the pandemic, I came into a revelation of the pandemic being a right now, being the very thing that God had been speaking to me about months prior and even a year and a half prior. But I did not put it all to anything because I didn't have anything to connect it with. But then on March the 18th of 2020, I came into a revelation of what God was saying to me, or that God, of what God, well, not so much a revelation of what God was saying to me necessarily, but a revelation that what God was saying is in reference to where we are now in the pandemic period, or where we were then on March the 18th in the pandemic. Well, now this is only 2 weeks later, March the 31st, not even a full 2 weeks later, but close enough. 2 weeks later, or days later, I have this revelation. I call it the vision / dream, or my vision / dream, my pandemic vision / dream. I'll go ahead on and I'll explain what it was that I saw. And then after me having the vision, I got up immediately and I knew God was talking. So I went and washed up and I got to my desk and I began to, or input into my laptop, God talking to me. And this was the 9th extensive conversation that he had with me up to that point, up to March 31st. 9 different times up to this point, or 8 different times up to this point. And this was the 9th time when he began to speak to me after I had this vision / dream. And I call that one, this is a period of deep mourning, because God said that this is a period of deep mourning. So the vision / dream is surrounded around that. But because I've already given in pieces what God stated to me on March the 31st, 2020, throughout some of all the recordings that I've already put out there, I won't read what he said to me post vision. After I had the vision and I sat back at my desk and began to type what he stated to me, I won't read that necessarily. But what I will do is give an interpretation of the dream as best as I can interpret it, but do not lock into the interpretation that which I supply in this recording or the next recording, however many recordings it will take for me to do this here. Why? Because there's layers in what God shows us, in what God gives us. And I don't want to lock people. That's where religion went wrong. That's where denomination goes wrong. That's where church goes wrong. We lock God into a certain formula, and he's not working outside of the formula that we concoct to explain him. Don't allow the Bible says we only see in part, we only hear in part, we only know in part. I'm only giving what I know in part, okay, as it relates to defining, or as it relates to me giving you all a clear understanding of what the vision is about. Okay, here we go. Between 6:30 and 7:30 a.m. this morning, I awoke from my night's sleep. Upon naturally awakening, I realized the time and felt the need to try and return to some sort of sleep for a short period due to the time. As I lay in bed, I began to experience either a vision or dream in my semi-conscious state. Now, I was logically and consciously awake, yet at the same time, I was not trying to be fully aware of my surroundings because I was still not complete with my ponderings. So I don't want to become so conscious of my surroundings that I lose sight of being able to spiritually look at my day, stand outside of my day and look down upon my day and see what needs to be done throughout the course of my day. As this vision or dream began, I'm just going to say vision, okay? As this vision began, I found myself immediately standing alone in a huge orange red clay dirt muddy field. The muddy field was like orange clay dirt, deep red, deep orange. The area can be described as in an area of nowhere, an area leading to nowhere. It was like I was just in a area that was void. It was nowhere. I saw no signposts, no red lights, no stop signs. I'll keep going. There was no vegetation or buildings or vehicles or people in my view. The area seemed very distant, impoverished, and abandoned. The sky was very cloudy and the atmosphere was as though the region I was standing in was very dreary or dim, or very drearily dim. The scene resembled that of what I would compare with Africa. The landscape and the atmosphere were indicative of some third world countryside. As I found myself standing in this muddy field out in nowhere, a large military-style truck, an 80s style 5-ton. If you were in the military during the 80s and the early 90s, you know deuce and a halves and 5 tons. This vehicle looked more like a 5-ton with the canopy on the back. But let's keep going. A large military, keyword military style truck, an 80s style 5-ton, with its enclosed canopy and high drop down tailgate, drove up out of seemingly nowhere. This vehicle just showed up out of nowhere. It approached me from behind and drove roughly 50 feet in front of me and parked. Once stopped, several black men began, or should I say males, began to exit this military style vehicle and move toward the backside of the vehicle itself. As they began to do so, black males of all ages began to approach the vehicle from seemingly every direction. At this point, it seemed as though the entire area became busy with activity connected to the purpose for which the military style vehicle appeared in front of me. In other words, at this point, it seemed like everything began to be busy. I started seeing movement all around, little jitters, some type of sound, but movement. There was just movement. People out of nowhere, workers, appeared, just doing their thing, not paying me any attention. Both the trucks and the human activity were all around me, or should I say both trucks and human activity were all around me. Those who were near the military truck in front of me quickly began to position themselves at and within the bed of that military style 5-ton truck to somehow assist in whatever was going on. I also noticed that the workers were all black males of diverse ages, from very young ages to beyond middle ages, who were all naked and without any PPE gear to protect them from the contamination of the virus. And strangely, I could not make out any of the workers' faces or their facial features. I couldn't make out their faces or their facial features, though I did know and recognize the fact that they were black-skinned. As the male workers dropped down the tailgate of the military-style truck that was in front of me and began their activities, I immediately noticed that, well, first of all, if you know the military-style deuce and a half or 5-ton, you know how that tailgate drops down. It drops all the way down. It swings. You drop it all the way down. Well, when they dropped that down, I immediately noticed that the inside bed of the truck, which is huge, was filled with dead bodies. The bodies were those of completely naked males and females, young and old, who all seemed to be black, as I could not recall seeing anyone who was not of color in that pile of dead bodies. They all seemed to be black. I could not recall seeing anyone who was of any other color than black. Many of the bodies were in bad shape. Many of the bodies within the bed of the truck were very bloodied, mangled, dismembered, and disembodied, in that the organs were disembodied. They were no longer inside of the body where they should be, but they were hanging outside of the body. Some had already been ripped away from the body parts, internal organs. Neither was recognizable by me. No one was recognized by me on that truck, other than their skin tone and gender. I could not make out any identifiable facial features of the deceased. As each of the workers quickly began to offload the bodies of the dead and their dismembered parts and organs, and discard of them by tossing them from within the truck's bed onto the ground located between myself and the truck itself, I realized that I was standing within or beside a huge, hewed out hole. In other words, as they began to take these body parts and organs and these dead people off the truck, they began to throw them off the truck, and there was space between me and the truck, and they were throwing the bodies and the parts and all right there between the truck and myself, just throwing them. And I looked and I realized that I was standing in a huge, hewed out hole, where a hole had been dug out in the ground. And I was standing in that ground, in that pit. It dawned on me that I was standing within or beside a human grave site. What I thought was an exceptionally large hole of some sort was actually a mass grave site. So now here I am standing up in a mass grave site in a orange, red type, muddy, dirt, clay field. But I was actually standing in a mass grave site. I found myself standing in the presence of dead bodies of mass numbers that were being disposed of in a desecrating and inhumane manner. The bodies of those being dispersed were in terrible condition. Again, some of the bodies of the dead were bloodied and dismembered, with organs and other fluids spilling out onto the workers themselves as they were removing those body parts and those people from the truck. The bodies of the dead were being mishandled and thrown around by the workers as though the dead were nothing more than household trash being discarded at some landfill. It was as though those who had deceased were of no importance, or whose lives had no significance or relevance. As each of them, the workers that is, as each of them quietly worked in a hurried fashion, I vaguely heard the workers have some form of verbal communication at points, though it seemed to be in an unknown language that they were speaking in. Each of the workers were, for some reason, completely naked as they performed their understood robotic duties. In other words, these workers, they mumbled some things, but I couldn't understand what they were saying, but they were saying something. But they just completely ignored me, and they just focused on what they were doing. And they were just in a hurry at doing what they were doing. They weren't necessarily sad or anything. They were just working. And it's like their work was robotic. Like they knew what to do, and they understood what to do, and they were just carrying it out just like a robot would. What I noticed was that the workers themselves were fearless and void of any sympathy or respect for the deceased. Neither worker showed any human emotion as they worked amongst all the dead bodies. It grossly amazed me that each worker seemed cold and nonchalant as they went about their duties. Each worker appeared to be completely numb and non-responsive to the number of dead bodies and the physical conditions of those dead bodies. Even as the workers were being splattered with the bodily fluids of the deceased, no one other than myself was disturbed in the least bit. Each worker, both young and older ones, tirelessly performed their duties without complaint or emotional display, which puzzled me, as I was very emotionally disturbed by all that I was seeing. I instinctively knew that more vehicles with dead bodies were en route and waiting to be offloaded as well, which was when I immediately awakened or regained consciousness. Once conscious, I exited my bed to wash up before going to my computer desk to type out the vision/dream that I just experienced, as I knew that God was wanting to speak to me regarding it and hopefully the significance of it. That's what I was hoping for. And he did just that. So there you have it. The vision/dream. Now, I'm going to end this recording because I want the interpretation of the dream to be a separate recording than the actual dream itself or the vision itself, because it seemed more like a vision than it did a dream. I'm not a dreamer. I don't dream like that. I'm not a visionaire necessarily, but I do envision. I do vision things. I have vision things. but nothing of this nature necessarily. I can vision messages that I speak. I can vision the crowd, the individuals that'll be in that crowd. I can envision when someone disagrees or is not fully understanding or accepting what it is that I'm speaking. I can see those type things. I can see those things before they occur. But I've not had to vision something like this. Very rarely do I dream. And when I do dream, those things seem to play themselves out exactly as I dreamt them. But anyway, moving from here, we'll go on into our next segment, which will be the revelation or the interpretation, the understanding of what it is that this vision speaks regarding. Not the fullness of it, but that which I know in part. That will be pretty lengthy. But anyway, let's go to the next one. Thank you.